Welcome to the Warrior Razor podcast. My name is Elias Johnson. On today's episode, my mommy is telling a story of two Warrior Razor midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. She'll be teaching about these two brave ladies and how they feared God more than the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh. I hope you enjoy the message.
Well, welcome to the Warrior Razor podcast. I'm your host, Angela Johnson. I'm really excited to have you here with me today. And in coming off of the heels of Mother's Day weekend, I thought, what a great opportunity to talk about two women, two warrior razors, and their story I think a lot of us mamas can relate to. Their story is found in Exodus 1, and their names are Shiphrah and Puah. And I have a special affinity for these ladies because they are midwives. And I'm a former labor and delivery nurse, and I think that it's just really neat how the Bible just captures this profession, and they are just exalted in the pages of history. And their roles, sometimes, people have glossed over their names and thought that they were just kind of minor characters. But these two women, they had such bravery and boldness and fear for God that it allowed them to be captured forever in history and have eternal reward for what they did. So in today's message, I'm affectionately referring to it as called the Midwives. And we're going to get into the verses. I'm going to break it down, give you a little context, and hopefully you'll be able to have a richer understanding and beyond seeing them as two nice Bible characters, be able to apply their story to your life today, because there is a profound lesson in their heroism and what they did to preserve the Hebrew nation. And I'm excited to bring the word to you today. So there is still a lot of controversy as to whether these two women were Hebrews or they were Egyptians. But we'll break it down and I'll kind of give you my perspective. And you know what? At the end of the day, whether they were Hebrew or Egyptian, the outcome of their obedience was what really mattered. So we're gonna get into Exodus chapter 1. I'm gonna give you a little bit of context. So beginning in verse 6, it says, Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation eventually died out. If you don't know the story of Joseph, hop back on over to Genesis, because you will be able to read a lot of his story in its entirety, beginning in chapter 27 and ending at the very end of the book in verse 50. And it talks a lot about Joseph and his struggles and what he had gone through and his rise to becoming the second in command. He was Hebrew born, but became second in command only to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh entrusted him with the nation and gave him all the rights and privileges of any highest ranking official within the Egyptian kingdom, and he was trusted implicitly. He helped bring the nation out of famine. And at that time, the Hebrew nation, all of the Israelites had become foreign aliens and were living in Egypt. So Joseph and his family and that entire generation has died off now here at the beginning of Exodus. And then in verse 7 it says, but the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Verse 8, a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further, and when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. Which I find very interesting, because it doesn't give any indication that there was any contention, if they were not living peaceably. It's because this guy's ego, because Pharaohs often thought of themselves as gods, he sees this nation multiplying and he starts to get worried. He starts to feel threatened by these people that were foreigners living in their land. So then it goes on to say, verse 11, so the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramesses as supply cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all of this work on them. which is so interesting because this Pharaoh had no idea that he was in the middle of an Abrahamic covenant being fulfilled. So if we bounce back over to Genesis, we can see that Abraham, the father of the Israelite nation, was given this call and given this covenant blessing beginning in 12 verse 2. I'm going to start. It says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. So, and then it goes on, and flip the page here. It says, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And it repeats, there's a promise that his offspring would number the grains of the sand and that they would number the stars in the sky. So no wonder the Israelite nation is multiplying at this time. So it goes on, and we pick back up. And they're in the land of Egypt, right? And they are foreign aliens there, and they are multiplying under the harshest of condition, and basically they are slaves. So when we pick up in verse 16, it says, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives. This is the beginning of our introduction to Shiphrah and Puah. The first whose name was Shiphrah, and the second whose name was Puah. I'm going to take a break here and talk to you about these two women. Like I said, there's a lot of discussion over whether they were Hebrew or Egyptian. And I'm going to take it today from the slant that I could be wrong, right? Because we're not perfect and only God knows the whole story. And a lot of stuff gets lost over time, depending on who is writing it down. And they were women, so they might have been seen as secondary characters in history, but God made it known that they needed to be earmarked in the pages of the Holy Scriptures. So again, there's still a lot of discussion over whether they were Egyptian or Hebrew, but it's their heroism that is what's the profound role that they played. But I don't think that Pharaoh would have employed Hebrew women to fulfill the task that the edict that he puts on them. And what he goes on to ask them is that in verse 16, when you help the Hebrew women give birth, observe them as they deliver. If the child is a son, kill him. But if it's a daughter, she may live. And there's some versions that talk about when they're on the birthing stool and you watch them. And I just love this little part of history because this is still a practice that we do today in labor and delivery and midwifery, doulaing, whatever, obstetricians. Women will labor in this way. Sometimes you see people laying on their backs, but in ancient days, in antiquity, these midwives, they were mostly called to affluent homes, but if regardless of whoever they would help, sometimes they would bring a birthing stool. So sometimes it was carved out of wood and kind of like a U shape. It looked like a glorified potty, and it had like a hollow inlet. So when they would use gravity, and the baby would fall onto like soft blankets, and they would be on their knees. Other birthing stools were 2 bricks or 4 bricks on either side, and the woman would squat on them, put her feet on them, and kind of squat down and bear down that way and deliver the baby on the birthing stool that way. So what Pharaoh is essentially saying is when they're in that position and the mom cannot see whether she's delivered a baby or a baby boy or a baby girl, they didn't have ultrasounds back then, so everything was always a surprise. My 2 boys were surprises, but by the time I was pregnant with the third, I needed to know, is this another boy or am I dealing with a girl? But what Pharaoh is asking them is to go ahead, and once this sex or the gender was decided at the time of delivery, to go ahead and make the decision. If it's a boy, go ahead and kill the baby at that point in time. And I think it's just interesting that infanticide has been around since the dawn of time. This is the 2nd book in the Bible, and we're reading about this practice. And we've seen this over and over in history. It's happening today. You even if you read about the story of Jesus, when he came to be when he came to earth, he was born a baby in a manger. We read that story in Luke 2. And the king at the time, again, jealous, hears that there's a new king that was born, and he goes ahead and kills all the babies born in Bethlehem. It's a really horrifying story, but again, it's prophecy being fulfilled. And sometimes evil things are done by the hands of evil men, but God can turn that around and he can use it for his glory. So here these Egyptian, I'm going to call them Egyptian midwives, were given this horrible task. These are women that have dedicated their entire lives to bringing life into the world, helping bring life from the womb into the world, and they're being asked to murder these babies at the time of their delivery. And so the scripture goes on to say in verse 17 of chapter 1, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. This is the spirit of midwifery, of obstetrician. It's the spirit of labor and delivery nurses. We cherish life. We bring life in and we don't take it out. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this and let the boys live?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous." And that word, if you study it out, it's likening them to like beasts of the field. They're lively. They're strong like animals, strong like ox, and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So they don't come out and give a full lie, but they kind of give a half truth. But then it goes on. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very numerous. And since the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Some scholars have said that these women ended up being in Hebrew lineage, but again, we don't really know. There's a lot of discussion either side of that, but either way, God blessed them, and he made sure that their obedience was blessed. And then verse 22, but even though they did that and they spared these lives, Pharaoh, because he was evil, he says that he then commanded all his people, "You must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile, but let every daughter live." Okay, so let's back this up a little bit. I think it's interesting, and I want to highlight the point of why I think that they were probably Egyptians. Josephus is an ancient scholar. He is one, Ibn Ezra. He's an ancient Jewish historian as well. Josephus said that, I'm going to read this part because I don't want to miss this quote up, that he would never have employed Hebrew women to destroy the males of their own nation. How could it be that Pharaoh could have commanded the Israelite women to annihilate their own people by killing off the male offspring and believe that no one would find out about the matter? If Pharaoh's going to commit this infanticide, he was probably not going to employ Hebrews to kill Hebrews. So that's why I personally think that they were Egyptians. Josephus assumes that the midwives must have been Egyptians too, and that the Pharaoh would never have entrusted such a duty to the Hebrews' own kinsmen. Or kinswoman in this case. Ibn Ezra, again, this ancient Jewish historian, he writes that Puah and Shiphrah are Egyptian names. Now, we can also find in biblical concordances that they have Hebrew meanings as well. And I'm going to give you the meanings of their name too, because I like to do that. But these two women were chiefs over all the midwives. So it's not that they were there delivering all the Hebrew babies at that time, but he says that these two women were chiefs over all the midwives, who were more than 500. And as superintendents of such a large staff to which they had been appointed by the Egyptian government, Pharaoh ordered them to carry out this terrible command, just as he would give orders to any other of his officials, as it is likely that only the chief Hebrews could afford the services of midwives. Probably the order of Pharaoh only applied to them. So he goes on to say, although Egyptians by birth, it would seem as if they had embraced the Hebrew faith. For we are told that Puah and Shiphrah feared God in verse 21. So maybe because they had been around these women and assisted them in their delivery, that they were able to see that the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, was so much more than the gods of the Egyptian, because the gods, they were monotheistic, or they weren't monotheistic in Egypt. They had multiple gods, and they had multiple idols, multiple sacrifices having to be made, rituals. But the Hebrews, they only had one God, and that was Yahweh. And so when we look at the definition of the Egyptian meanings of their names, I think it lends itself to more of an understanding of why I think that they were, in fact, Egyptian midwives. Shiphrah means fair, or to prolific, or to procreate. Puah, in Hebrew, it means splendid, but in the Egyptian meaning of the name is childbearing, or joy of parents. So again, we don't know whether they were Hebrew or Egyptian or not, but both of those definitions lend itself to the role that these women both stepped into and carried with dignity, respect, and diligence. They really upheld the office of midwifery very, very nobly and well. Again, it seems like they might have been a team, who knows, but they were really faced with a really difficult dilemma. Here's the Pharaoh, the highest ranking man in the world at that time, gives them an order, and they had to make a really difficult decision whether to obey him or not. But they feared God more, so they were willing to essentially sacrifice their own lives. And I don't know if you and I, we could be as brave and as bold if we knew that decision might mean being killed ourselves, because by them defying his edict, they could have been killed right then and there by the Pharaoh. But again, they had this fear of the Hebrew God, Yahweh, and because of the fear of God, not like scared fear, but they had an awe, they had a reverential fear, they had just an adoration for Yahweh. They did not want to disappoint him. It was more important to disappoint man than it was to disappoint God. So it says that they saved the men children alive, or that they let the boys live. Just to kind of dive into this a little bit more, I think that it's really neat to see the birthing story, and we don't get a lot of history as to biblical birthing because they were women, and women told oral traditions, and it was captured that way. But the standing or the kneeling, that was kind of a neat thing. But the other thing was that when the babies were born, they were washed by the midwife, and we can see what the process was in Ezekiel 16:4. But when the new baby was given special care, they were washed, they were rubbed with salt, wrapped in swaddling clothes, and given over to their mom. Same thing happened with Jesus when he was laid in that manger. It's really neat. They were washed with salt because it had an antiseptic quality. The water that would help dilute the salt, and sometimes they would use wine as an antiseptic, and then they would use this olive oil or an oil to soothe the baby's skin and put it on the eyes. We still do that today. We put special medication on the eyes to help with the birthing process. But again, it's really neat to see the layers of this story. It's not just 6 verses and, oh, that's nice. That's a nice little story. But I think the ultimate lesson is the fear of God versus the fear of man. He commands them to be his co-conspirators in a plot to disseminate the Hebrew population, but they never carry out his plan. It's a bold, faith-filled move, but the results are a mixed bag of blessings, they obey, but right afterwards, all these babies are thrown into the Nile. And I think that it's really important to understand that we're called to be obedient, but we're not responsible with the outcome of that obedience, because what happens? I don't think that these women were able to see the immediate result of this obedience. But 80 years later, we find that Moses would be the one to rise out of these saved babies and redeem the Hebrew nation. He would lead the people out of slavery and out of captivity. Maybe Moses was one of the babies that they saved. There is some conversation about that. There's some they have partnered Shiphrah and Puah with Jochebed you can pronounce her name a couple different ways, who was Moses's mother. And she decided to keep him till he was about 3 months old. And then what does she do? She puts him into the reeds in the Nile, and then Moses is found by Pharaoh's daughter. And we can see that whole situation play out in the story of within Exodus. And so these women had a part to play in that. By their obedience, they were able to help save an entire generation that would then be part of the exodus of Egypt and Egyptian slavery, and eventually find their way to the promised land. And so they probably didn't live that long to see it. And sometimes when we're obedient, we might not see the fruit of our harvest in our own lifetime. But I think that the valuable lesson is, who do we fear more? Who do we want to align ourselves more? Is it the fear of man, or is it the fear of God? And I think that this is really important, because I know I struggle with this. What will people think, or what will people say? Sometimes we think of God as some lofty guy in the sky, and when you're seeing the people in your day to day, it's easier sometimes to get more concerned with what they think about you than what God thinks. And sometimes when people are left to their own imagination, they're going to fill in gaps and create their own narrative, and we can't always own the responsibility of setting every crooked path straight. But sometimes when we fear how others view us, we compromise what we know to be true. And that's what this is a lesson about. It's you cannot compromise truth. You cannot compromise because you fear what man thinks, or fear what friends think, or fear what the world around you thinks. We're called to be obedient. So again, they're part of this covenant fulfillment, this covenant promise, and they had no idea of it, that they were preserving and protecting this generation that would fill a prophecy that God made to Abraham 2,000 years beforehand. So I think that it's a really wonderful story. And when we look through that lens, it'll give us perspective on our situations today. Obedience does not mean a perfect life, but it does mean it changes and it sanctifies us, and it helps grow us, and it draws us into this greater dependence with our Savior. Romans 8:30-31 says, and those he predestined, or those he's called, he has also justified. And those he has justified, he has also glorified. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? So if it's the fear of man versus the fear of God, that's the lesson here. We cannot be more fearful of what our peers think. It's tough. I mean, this is a tough generation that we're raising our children in. It's tough when you see things going on in the media and you want to be quiet because you don't want to make waves, or you don't want to cause dissension, or you don't want to offend. But here's the thing. We're called to be obedient. We're called to live in absolute truth, not relative truth. And if you're feeling weak in that area, go ahead, get some resources. There's tons of stuff out there that'll help undergird your faith and give you the confidence that you can walk in full obedience. And it is a sacrifice, and we're not called to a life without it. But then you can always rely on the word, and for every problem, there's a verse, right? For every issue, there's a scripture. Psalm 56:3-4 says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? It's easy to say, yeah, I'm not fearful, but these women, they were probably riddled with fear. Every time that a baby boy was born, you best believe they were looking over their shoulders, making sure that nobody was there to rat them out for keeping this baby alive. But with every life that was spared, they were being diligent to the calling that God gave them, and they were called to bring life into this world, and God rewarded them for that, and he blessed them. But while he blessed them, there were many, many other babies that were thrown into the Nile and lost their lives. But because of that, because of their diligence, because of their obedience, Moses was spared. And through his legacy, there was an entire generation that was able to come out of slavery And we now know that they made it to the promised land. And it's such a rich part of our biblical history, of the history of both Jew and Gentiles, because if you're saved and you're not Jewish by birth, you're born into that family. So you are part of this legacy too. And I just think it's a beautiful testimony that sometimes we don't know where you are today. If your job is calling you to do something that might be a little less than appropriate, or if you're seeing some stuff and you're just like, I don't want to say anything, I don't want to make a wave, but you know it's not right, you know it's wrong, and you know you need to speak up. I think God's calling us to that level of obedience, ladies. I think that God is calling us to that level of obedience, mama. God is calling us to that level of obedience, parent. So we have a role to play, and it's to preserve the legacy. It's to preserve the generation, and it's a heavy calling. It's a not an easy calling, but it's not one that's not without blessing. So I hope that you enjoyed the story of Shiphrah and Puah, and you can find a little bit of encouragement in their obedience, and know that sometimes when we're faced with really tough stuff, it's okay, because we don't have to fear. And like Psalm 56:3 says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. And he's the answer. He's the answer to every issue that we will ever face. So thank you for spending the time with me today. Hopefully you'll be able to read back over their story, and now that you will have new insight into the calling that these two midwives had on their lives, and the effect that it's had on your life, the effect that it's had on my life today. So thank you for your time today, and to all of my fellow warrior raisers, aim your arrows well.